Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1982 to take a look at James Brown, and he's going to be performing There Was a Time. This is my second look at James Brown over a short period of time because I did say in the first video that I did that I'd cover some of his history, but also get into why his songs are so funky and you can't help but dance along to them and jump around to them as the audience do in this particular performance. But let's get James up on screen and see how he gets on. I'm just going to jump in here just when we have that cut to the crowd and everyone is so into this performance to the point of screaming out in the middle of it because James Brown got everyone involved within the performance. Something that I said in the first video that I did. You feel like you're on stage with him, totally part of the performance because of the way that he keeps you engaged and looks for that feedback from the audience. And I'm sure that James Brown would much rather play to a small audience who are totally into it than thousands of people who were just sitting there and weren't really bothered. I think it's the same with every true performer. They really want to feel that connection with the crowd, and James Brown has that in spades. And the fact that this is a small crowd because it's from Late Night with David Letterman, but everyone's totally into it and they just get more and more into it the further we progress throughout the songs, because James does 3 songs here. I think initially he was only supposed to do 1 on the show, but it was just something that David Letterman allowed him to go on for as long as he wanted to because of the quality of the performance. I mentioned all the guys from the world's most dangerous band in that first video, and with this performance, listen out to Will Lee on the bass, because some of the lines that he's throwing in there are so complex, but also there is so much feel and groove in what he's playing, which is essential to the underlying feel of the performance. And James Brown, you can tell, has got that respect for the band and vice versa, but we are going to be breaking it down a little bit so that hopefully, even if you don't play an instrument or you aren't musically inclined, you might understand why this kind of music and funk in general with James Brown was so infectious, and you just had to move to it because of the syncopation and the emphasis points that we have throughout all of the band here. It really does move from instrument to instrument, but they all approach it the same way. So what does syncopation mean? It's basically a disturbance or interruption in a flow of rhythm. So it means that when you've got a bar of music, and I'm going to try and keep this simplistic, if we're doing a 4/4 time signature, it means that we're just going to be counting to 4 and attributing a number to each of those beats. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are points at which you can emphasize not the numbers, but the distance in between those numbers will have another hit point. And the simplest example of that is going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So the ands are between the numbers. And this is what happens when you've got a groove or a funky groove like we've got here. We get a lot of emphasis between numbers. So if we think about the emphasis being on the numbers, if you were to stomp your foot to the beat, your foot would hit the ground on 1, 2, 3, 4 on those numbers. Whereas with the ands, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, your leg would be going up in the air on the ands. And that's exactly what it feels like when you listen to a piece of music that is emphasizing the ands between the numbers. You want to lift your leg, you want to jump, you want to get into it because the emphasis isn't on the ground, it's in the air. And that's the most simple way that I can think to put it, so that you can understand the difference in feel between playing straight on the beat but then in between the beats. And this is something that they do on such a deep level here. I'm giving you quite a simple example of it, but it gives you the principle. To give a quick example, I've put together a drum beat of a foot pedal and a snare being played very straight, so we can have a listen to that and see what it sounds like. So now I'm going to play exactly the same thing, the same amount of foot pedals, the same amount of snares, but then inject a little bit of the groove into it by putting that foot pedal on the offbeats rather than on those numbers and being so straight. So this is what it's going to sound like. So you can hear that there is a difference there. Whether you can appreciate the difference between that first beat that I played and the second beat, you might not be able to, or you can feel that there was something slightly different between the two, and it's just that second beat, because it's got a little bit more emphasis on the offbeat, it sounds a little bit more bouncy, where the 3 foot pedals are being played and the other beat is just very middle of the road, straight down the line. Just to emphasize the point, I've got the guitar out just to show you how important 16th notes are in this groove, because we've got Hiram Bullock on rhythm guitar who's throwing in all of these 16th notes with so much feel and groove. But going from the example that we've just had, as counting the beats of the bar, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, we've got to now try and fit 16 notes within that same space. So it means that now I've got to pick a lot faster to fit 16 notes into that bar, and they're called 16th notes, and they sound like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm now picking a lot faster to get those 16th notes in there. Why it is so important is because you can emphasize in any direction on those 16th notes, and you can alternate between down picks and up picks. And up picks will be where that groove lies, and you can also alternate between always being on that offbeat if you want. So if I now play through, emphasizing those offbeats with those 16th notes, we get a totally different groove. So it'll sound a little bit like this. So you can start to hear how all of those little upstrokes and hops are giving it a different groove. It's all in this right hand with all of that. So the technique is happening in the right hand, and I'm just jumping on and off the fretboard in order to get that. You can see how important 16th notes are to this groove, because if we didn't have that many notes in there and that many picks, we couldn't do anything. Because if we just had 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can't do anything with that. There's no groove in there because we're just on the beat the whole time. We need to find the notes that can fit between the numbers and how fast those notes need to be played in order to access them. And then you can start to get a little bit of groove in there by just alternating that picking. So I hope that it's not too confusing, and you can start to get a bit of an appreciation as to why, when listening to this style of music, you feel like getting up and jumping around a bit because of all of that emphasis on the offbeats and all of that syncopation. The other thing to mention is that within the whole band, this is happening with every instrument. So the drummer sometimes is coming in after 2 on the beat, maybe 2.5, to give that extra little bit of jump and zest in there. Same with the bassist, same with the guitarist, same with the horn section. It goes across the board, same with the keys. They're all applying this syncopation, this emphasis on the offbeat to give that groove in there. So you can imagine that once you've got 4 or 5 guys all doing the same thing and taking it in turns, it adds to such a strong groove that if you didn't feel like dancing when you listen to the guitarist playing, then you definitely will once the bassist starts up and the keys player and the drummer and the horn section. So they all just come together in order to supply this solid groove throughout the whole performance. We are going to be getting into James Brown's career as well at the end of this video, but let's jump back into the performance and appreciate this groove.
Everybody come on. Say hey, hey, I feel all right. Now, listen to me now. Hey, hey, I feel all right. Now, do it one time, okay? Everybody say together. Hey, hey, I feel all right. One time. Wait a minute. Let's try 2 times. Now I say 2 times, you say, Now raise this right hand, I say, hey, hey, I feel all right. Or you say, You ready? You ready over there? Got a lot of groove over there. Are you ready right here? You done been a little weak there. You ready right there? What about over here? All right. You here? Everybody ready? What about way back there? Everybody get 2 times. Hey.
And there we have it. Just to get a deeper appreciation of the band, when James is talking to the crowd, saying that he wants them to do 2 hertz when he's singing, the band haven't rehearsed this. So the way that they're laying off the sound, bringing that dynamic down, but also keeping everything going whilst James is talking to the crowd, it is so impressive to think that they haven't rehearsed this. There's no way that James Brown got them together earlier in the day and said, I'm going to talk to the crowd for 12 bars or 16 bars or 24 bars. So massive respect to the world's most dangerous band, because this is really flying by the seat of your pants musically, because they haven't got any idea when James Brown is going to get into the vocal again and into the tagline of the song, the chorus, and when he's going to stop addressing the crowd. They just keep it looping around, and whenever he wants to get into a particular section, they're all taking their cue from him. So as soon as he starts, they're all so on the ball. And listen to the ending, because that is so tight, and it isn't something that they've rehearsed, but they all stopped exactly when James Brown wanted them to, and that is the sign of a fantastic band. Let me just mention as well that James Brown was 49 years of age during this performance, and it hadn't slowed him down one bit. Still, just as an enthusiastic performer as he ever was. And this is why, when you're watching him perform, and David Letterman was watching him perform, you just want to watch even more, because it's so entertaining on so many different levels. You can head over to the other James Brown video that I did for more performance elements, but we are going to get into the history here because I didn't manage to cover that in the other video. And James Brown grew up in poverty in South Carolina, and when he was 4 or 5 years of age, his family moved to Augusta, Georgia. And his mum and dad separated, unfortunately, because of abuse from the father's side to his mother. And he spent a lot of time, unfortunately, on the streets and hustling in order to make money any which way he could. He was talented. He entered talent competitions, and in 1944, he won one of those. But also hanging around on the streets, he unfortunately got arrested and got charged at age 16 with a crime. I'm not sure what that was, but he spent time then in a juvenile detention center. So while he was serving his time, he set up a gospel quartet. And this was the first time that he met Bobby Bird, and that was from playing basketball outside the detention center. And James then joined Bobby's band, and they became the famous Flames. So they got in touch with Little Richard, and if you want to check out Little Richard independently, he's on the channel here somewhere, but he said, get in touch with my manager. So they did. They spoke to Little Richard's manager and also performed Please, 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 and he was impressed, and through that they did get signed to King Records. So they recorded Please, Please, Please and released it in 1956, and it was a massive hit. It sold over 1 million copies, got to number 1 in the R&B charts, and in 1957 is when they signed a management deal with Ben Bart, and Ben wanted to change the name of the band to James Brown and the Famous Flames. This didn't sit very well with the rest of the band members, so they did separate at this time. In 1958, Try Me was released, and that was a massive number 1 hit in the R&B charts. It was the first of 17 that they would have. So the band was put back together by Bobby Bird, obviously with personnel changes, but because of the success, James Brown needed that backing band, and they would then be called James Brown and the Famous Flames. So during this period, they opened as well to Little Willie John, and this was in 1959, and this was James Brown's idol. So from the late 50s, getting into the early 60s, James started to get involved with production in the studio as well, and he had an idea in 1962 to record a live album, and this was going to be live at the Apollo, and that was in Harlem. And James financed that himself because the record label said they didn't think it was a very good idea, and it went on to sell over 1 million copies, stayed in the charts for 14 months, so it turned out that actually it was quite a good idea. In 1965 he released Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, another massive hit. He won a Grammy for that. Then I Got You, which was a number 1 in the R&B charts, but also a top 10 in the pop charts. So he was having that crossover appeal of charting in multiple genres. Also, It's a Man's World was released after I Got You, and massive #1 again in the R&B charts, top 10 in the pop charts again. In 1967, he continued that theme with another #1 in the R&B charts called Cold Sweat, and that was a top 10 hit in the pop charts as well. And that's been referred to as the first true funk song, as a sound and that genre. Having that success in 1967 meant that in 1968 he now had his own TV special, and in the early 1970s he added his own political views to his music in support of Richard Nixon with his presidential campaign. And unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that's always going to split opinions. So he experienced a drop in sales and attendances to his concerts because of his view politically. That slight decrease in popularity in the USA at that time, of course, didn't cross over to Europe. He was still massively popular. In 1973 is when he got his nickname of the Godfather of Soul. And this was also the time that he realized and was told that he owed the IRS $2 million in taxes. So that came as a bit of a shock. I'm sure James probably knew that he wasn't paying his taxes. He then released Papa Don't Take No Mess, which was a massive #1 again. And then interestingly, with the history with the IRS and owing them $2 million, Get Up Off of That Thing in 1976 was written by his kids and his wife. And this was just a way around the taxes that he'd have to pay on the royalties for that song. In the mid to late 70s, the style of music that was in at the time was disco, and everything was going in that direction. So it was moving away from James Brown's sound, and the IRS did catch up with James, and he had to pay what he owed. So it meant that financially, he wasn't in a great position, but throughout the 80s, he did have a resurgence in popularity by appearing in films. He was in The Blues Brothers in 1980. He was in Dr. Detroit in 1983, and also Rocky IV in 1985. That's a movie that I know well. He released Gravity in 1986, and his final top 10 hit was Living in America, which he won a Grammy for as well. At the end of the 80s, unfortunately, he had a period in prison, and 1991, when he was out of prison, he then set up a pay-per-view concert, and this was a massive success. He continued to perform and release music throughout the 90s as well. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to get through everything in this video, but fast forwarding to 2004, he performed at Hyde Park, and that was supporting the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He also performed at Live 8, and that was with Will Young. He also performed with Joss Stone, and that was on a show we have here in the UK called Friday Night with Jonathan Ross. In 2006, he continued his world tour. He was also inducted into the UK Music Hall of Fame in 2006, and that was in November. And towards the end of the year, unfortunately, James went to the dentist, and his dentist saw James and how ill he looked, and rather than complete the dentistry that was supposed to be done that day, he made sure that James went to hospital and got himself checked out. And this is the thing about James Brown, that he often performed whilst ill and never complained about anything, so it wasn't in his nature. But like I said, he did go to hospital, got himself checked out, and he expected to be released from hospital. He didn't think it was that serious, and he was making plans on still performing his New Year's Eve show, because this was around Christmas time. And unfortunately, as you probably already know, he passed away on Christmas Day in 2006. But James Brown, a legendary artist in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Songwriters Hall of Fame, 17 #1s, like I mentioned, and also he's the most sampled musician and artist of all time as well. So it means that his music lives on in so many future generations, and always will do, because of the feel of it, the groove, and the amount of expression that's in the music. People just love to sample James Brown's hits because of all of those elements in there. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. rock.